Okay, welcome to Beyond Assumptions, putting research into practice to document quality learning. Andrea, it's all yours.
Thank you, Beth. I appreciate you supporting me today. And I appreciate everybody joining in. And even though the technology may be something new that we're learning, I still find it absolutely amazing that we can do this from wherever we are. We can still come together to promote quality teaching and learning. And I think that is absolutely spectacular. Okay, today we're going to talk a little bit about some work that I did with Quality Matters, looking at academic rigor. And when we talk about academic rigor, the point of it is to define a quality learning experience. And I have put together some of the assumptions that I've heard and some of the research that I've looked into trying to find support for this. And then I'm going to synthesize for you today some of the research that I did looking for what a definition of academic rigor quality learning experiences is. So I am Andria Schwegler. I am a faculty member with A&M Central Texas. Yes, I just mentioned the weather in Alabama because I am remote to the university. I am the program coordinator for the Master of Science in our educational psychology program, and I'm an associate professor of psychology. Today, like I said, we're going to talk about what is a quality learning experience, throw out some assumptions about it, and then look at some definitions of it, try to put those in context of the broader educational picture, talking about what it includes and what it doesn't. We're going to distinguish academic rigor from confounded variables because I teach research methods, I think in those kind of terms, but from assumptions and confusions that people may have as well. Some of the things we'll talk about is mode of delivery, course grades, and idiosyncrasies of both students and faculty. And then the goal for this session is for you to take these materials back to your home institution, you may be there already, and have conversations with your colleagues about some of these things if you hear some of these assumptions as well. I have been an educator for over 30 years. I started out in the public schools as a pre-K teacher, and then I moved eventually into higher education. And I have heard a lot of information and assumptions about what is quality learning, what makes for good teaching. And so before we dive into the ideas that I'm bringing to you today, I wanted to hear what you've heard that maybe is questionable, that maybe is concerning. So in the chat, if you could just drop some ideas in the chat about what maybe you've heard. I do this kind of thing for fun. So if I don't have some research to bring to bear today on the assumptions that you've heard, I'm happy to look for it and do another presentation like this again. Okay, quality learning takes too much time. I've heard that about eating habits too. Healthy eating is too hard. It takes too much time to cook. It has to be challenging and rigorous. We forget about the supports that we can provide students. It's time consuming. Grades, I'm coming to grades, yes. It requires a lot of assessment. And we will talk about testing, but not in the way we usually think about testing. Oh, not possible when it's not done in person, face to face. I've got that one too, yes. It can be unpleasant for students. It's hard, it's difficult, it's challenging. Yeah, can students be adults and be responsible? It's not engaging. Oh, these are some great comments. Online classes, yeah, so we're seeing some common patterns here too. All right, I will dive into the ones that I couldn't get to later. Oh, it's boring, yeah. Okay, thank you for all of those wonderful comments that keep going on and on. Awesome. All right, well, let's dive in a little bit and I will try to hit some of these ideas and then maybe include some of them in the future in a presentation. Okay, mode of delivery, we got to hit that one first, right? In-person learning is the gold standard. This made the news recently. In some of the documents at my institution, we actually had wording in our curriculum manual that said online courses have to be as good as face-to-face courses. And there's the assumption that online learning is somehow better, just inherently better, without really having any indicators that it is. So before we get into the research, I do want to point you to a position statement. What are we talking about when we're talking about online learning? We're not talking about the emergency remote instruction part of it. That's not what the research is on. The research is on online learning from trained faculty who had intentionally planned and sequenced materials and courses. So the National Council for Online Education released a statement. It's maybe 2 weeks now, 2 weeks ago, and I've linked you to it if you haven't seen it yet, that emergency remote instruction is not online learning. And right now, post-COVID, there may be some confusion about that. So if you need to have a conversation with folks at your institution, I highly recommend you pointing them to that article. It's not long, but it will help give them an understanding of what we're talking about. Back in 2010, the US Department of Education published a meta-analysis that looked at online learning and face-to-face learning. And what we find is that there's no significant difference. Actually in the study, people who were learning online did a little bit better because they had a little bit more time on task. And if you controlled that, then there were no significant differences. And it is, oh yes, 2010 is a long time ago. Yeah, that this article is becoming dated is fantastic, because it's like, look how long we've known this. Come on, get with the program. But we also have other research and information, and I've linked you to the No Significant Difference database. That is an online database where we're bringing in more studies as they come in that compare online and face-to-face learning and learning outcomes. And what we find there is there's no significant difference. However, there are some studies that show a significant difference. And as quick scroll through the database, you'll see that the learning with technology tends to come out ahead when there is a difference. So, but they're not trying to exclude any articles and only show a select few. They're showing the articles that are there. So if you need some resources, you might want to go take a look at that database. Another assumption I've heard about what makes something rigorous or quality is that we have high standards. We admit only the most qualified applicants, and that's great. If you can do that, that's fantastic. The unfortunate thing is that there are some students who may not be academically prepared. What's going to happen to them? Some of the problems with linking student qualities to academic rigor is the idea of, well, if they're coming in with these skills, how can you take credit for giving them to them? We know from research in psychology on intelligence, there is a general factor, a italicized lowercase g is referred to as G, which is the general factor for intelligence. If you have it in one area, you tend to have intelligence in other areas. So even if you don't have a very rigorous or quality program, if you select a really strong person who's intelligent, they're going to be successful regardless of what you do because of this factor. Now, there is controversy about G and the different areas you can be more or less strong, but it is something that is pretty robust in the literature that, okay, you can't really take credit for that. And Sheeny and some qualitative research that she has done, she did acknowledge that implementing rigor is complicated by the range of students' abilities and backgrounds. So whenever we don't have like minimum GREs or SAT scores and students come in, maybe it is a little bit more challenging to meet them where they are and provide those scaffolding and supports that they need. Another characteristic of students is their particular learning style. When we talk about learning styles, this is typically defined as something that is idiosyncratic, that a person has a preference, and if we can match to that preference, then they're going to learn better, perform better on an outcome test than somebody who doesn't have that learning style matched. The VARK acronym stands for visual, auditory, reading and writing, and knowledge. And the idea is that if we can test a student, figure out what their preference is, and then match instruction to it, they're going to learn better. The problem with that idea is there's no really good experimental research that does that. You would test a statistical interaction so that you would have different types of presentation. You would assess students on different learning styles, and then you would see who performs better when it matches and who performs worse when it doesn't. Well, a lack of studies, and the studies that do exist don't support this assumption. So we have a hard time with, oh yes, kinesthetic, K is kinesthetic, I'm sorry. I'm not sure what I said, but it's kinesthetic, touching, active, doing. Instead of thinking about this in terms of like a learning style and trying to identify what it is and then just pinpoint that for a particular student, Richard Mayer has research on multimedia instruction and multimedia learning. And the article that I've linked you to here is a review article. It reviews over 30 years of research. It has meta-analyses included in it. So if you really want to do a deep dive, there are some articles there that you can go pull and take a look. And he talks about instructional methods that are related to learning. And instead of looking at it as an individual difference per student, looking at ways that we can better create instructional materials for everybody to reduce cognitive load and to have your auditory and your visual system processing together in a more efficient manner. So that would be a better way to consider using multimedia presentation of materials than trying to match to a learning style. Trying to link rigor to idiosyncratic experiences is another example that I've seen. It's like my courses are rigorous because I teach the way I was taught. One of the problems with this is we may think that how it has been done is how it should be done. And I know when I left the public school classroom and the active learning strategies that I used in the pre-K classroom, I thought I had to act like a professor. And those expectations of trying to do it the way other people were doing it were really limiting. And whenever that is assumed, then maybe we don't use the best strategies. Maybe we think we have to do it and continue to do it the way it's always been done. This shows the power of descriptive and injunctive norms. We know about that from social psychology. So I learned very quickly that I needed to change my technique. And other faculty have talked about how idiosyncratic experiences shape their definitions of rigor as well. In Sheeny's research, she interviewed both faculty members and students on their perceptions of rigor. Well, because a faculty member had completed a PhD program, they thought their courses weren't very rigorous because they had a lot more rigor in their coursework. But the students who were in the program, in a worker education program, they thought the courses were very rigorous. Well, who do we believe? If there's no one way of looking at it and we link it to our past experiences, we can't define those. So those are not very effective ways of saying this is rigor and this is not. And then students' grades. I've seen the assumption that I know my courses are rigorous because all my students make A's and I support them, or I have a normal distribution of grades in my courses. I've seen it go both ways. Whenever we look at the research on students' grades, some students do express the entitlement that I paid your salary in my tuition, so I should get a good grade. It's very much an exchange theory where students pay for something and they expect to get it. I see that as like going to the gym. I sign up for my gym membership. Where's my muscles? Well, you don't get them just by signing up. It's like learning is the same way. You don't get it just by paying your tuition. Also, in a different take on this, looking at grade inflation, Schultz and colleagues noted that almost half the faculty in their sample of over 1,500 full-time and adjunct faculty members, they reported assigning higher final grades than the student actually earned. So whenever students get higher grades than what they put in, well, then it's not surprising that they may think, well, I just pay tuition and I get that. But that's not an indicator of what they've actually learned if grades are being assigned without that in consideration. So did I miss anything? Or did this rattle any more ideas or assumptions loose that you'd like to add that you didn't think of before? And I'll go through this list and I'll address some of the comments and find research on them. Pay to pass. Oh, right. Yeah, the lack of national rubrics for looking at face-to-face learning. And yes, K is kinesthetic. I don't know what I said. I apologize. Okay, more about the correlation of grades to rigor. I've seen a couple of articles on that. There's actually an article, and I didn't include it in this presentation, but if you want to email me, I'll give you my email address, that shows that students actually like the rigor in their courses. All right, keep the questions coming as you think of them, or assumptions or things we need to dig deeper into, instead of just merely accepting it, having a research arsenal to address it, where it's not coming just from one opinion against another, I think is very helpful for conversation. It moves the conversation forward, and just arguing that one opinion is as good as the other. So we've talked about assumptions and some research that shows, well, maybe this isn't it. So what are these quality learning experiences? I reviewed a couple of areas of research for the white paper, and then I added in high impact practices because it's very similar as well. First, I looked at the research literature in teaching and learning, where we asked folks directly, what is academic rigor? And then high impact practices. And then cognitive psychology takes a very different stance, but I've tried to grab some articles from it to make them easy to access and integrate into these ideas. These are just a couple of articles that I pulled from the teaching and learning literature. Draeger and colleagues asked faculty members at their institution how they defined rigor, and they synthesized these definitions, and they found some common themes across them: higher order thinking. So think of Bloom's taxonomy, not just the basic comprehension, but the higher synthesis and creation and evaluation. Active learning experiences, students need to be doing something. Appropriate expectations, so that they're leveled to the nature of the course. And then meaningful content, not just something that's maybe obscure, but something that students will be doing in their future work. Sheeny used a similar definition in her research. It is deep, critical, inquiry-based learning, sufficient scaffolding. The students there were not in the worker education program, were not very well prepared academically to come to college, so they needed a lot more scaffolding. High standards, don't lower the expectations, raise the students up with the extra supports. And then also something that was unique to her study was integration of lived experiences with knowledge from research. These were older working adults, and they had a lot of experiences to use to interpret the world already. Acknowledging that, but then also encouraging them to take the new content they had and integrate those two was very important, because even though you may be older and very well experienced, nobody knows it all. So being able to have room in their working definitions of how things work for this new knowledge was important. High impact practices, there's a list of these, and I've linked you to them if you are interested in learning more about each one, but they include writing intensive courses, service learning, undergraduate research. And looking across these, there's a body of research on these as well. A lot of it's based on the NSSE, the National Survey of Student Engagement. And Q and O'Donnell pulled together some common themes, and then Reed added some case studies to illustrate these themes. High expectations, that is there again. Ongoing substantive interactions with faculty and peers are helpful for making these things high impact in reality, not just in name. Structured reflection and synthesis of learning. So again, that speaks to that higher level thought process where you're bringing ideas together. And then real world application, not just something you learn in the classroom that stays in the classroom. And I see real world application in the chat. So that is something that is important in those high impact practices. And cognitive psychology, unless you've are into it, it may be a little bit different perspective for you. So what I've tried to do is grab some general interest articles that don't make you do too much of a deep dive into the nuts and bolts of like particular research paradigms, but that do help make a convincing argument that you can have a conversation with colleagues about, that demonstrate how our perceptions of learning and how we think we learn things best are not accurate. And we know this from lots of areas in psychology, social psychology, decision-making, cognitive, that we have heuristics and we have biases and we have processing differences so that we don't truly see the world objectively. And so just because we've learned something, we don't know a lot about how we know things just by having learned something. So we need to do research on this. These studies will give people an opportunity to learn something and then test on it to see which condition helped improve their learning a little bit better. A conclusion from Cornell and Bjork, early on, they were examining mass versus spaced practice, is that our perceptions of learning are not terribly accurate. When we cram for a test one night, we remember it, it's very salient, we think we're going to do great, we don't perform as well as when we spread out our practice over a period of time. We remember that better, but we don't like it. It doesn't feel like we're learning as effectively. So we're less likely to engage in those behaviors, and those can set us up to not learn as effectively as we could. In later research, they performed 12 experiments in this study, and they found a stability bias in memory, so that what we know right now, we think we're always going to know it. We underestimate how much stuff we forget and will forget, and we overestimate how much we tend to think we'll remember everything we know right now. So what they did in their study was they had people rate, what do you think about studying? Is it helpful for learning? Unsurprisingly, people said, yeah, of course, you need to study. It'll help you learn. But when they were given an opportunity to study over different time periods, and they had to predict how much would you study in the first session, in the second session, in the third session, they underestimated how much studying would actually help them, even though they believed it would. Whenever they were given the memory test, they remembered a lot better with more study sessions, but they didn't think they would learn as much as they actually did. The implication of that is our students may not think they need to study as much as they need to study. So what can we do in the classroom to structure and design our courses to give them those opportunities to touch the information instead of relying on how they think they should study or not giving them study strategies at all? If you want to do a deep dive into some of the research articles, you can look at these meta-analyses. If you want more of a bird's eye view, I provided a couple of meta-analyses for you to take a look at if you need to use these in conversations back in your institution. We do know that context affects memory of information. If you learn something in a classroom, you're going to be more likely to remember it in that same context. The implication is that makes transfer hard, so that if you are in a context that's very different from your classroom, you're not taking advantage of these context effects to remember that information. The other side of that is the more closely we can make our classroom experiences mimic what folks will see in the real world, maybe that will help them remember to use it later. It'll help that sense of transfer. And then, like I summarized on the previous research, we have meta-analyses that mass practice is not as helpful for your learning as space practice is. Another article that's easy to translate from cognitive psychology into the classroom is Roediger and Karpicki, and they looked at the testing effect. The testing effect is one of the more robust phenomenon that we know about, in that you need to have like small stakes tests frequently on information, because having taken a test on the information, you will remember it better than if you spent the same amount of time just restudying the information. They argue that there's something about testing where you not only have to take the information in, but you have to retrieve it and bring it out, that changes the quality of that information so that we can retain it a little bit better. So looking at course design, if we have a course that has only a midterm and a final, that doesn't really bode well, because we're not having this opportunity. Yes, I use it as formative assessment. Low stakes, repeated testing through the semester is a lot more effective for learning. So we know these strategies. Are we using them? And then the Bjork article that I've linked here, it is a review article over lots of research, and it describes desirable difficulties. And it kind of pulls together this idea that we want to learn the way we think it's right, but maybe not the way that's best, because it feels better to do it an easier, less effective way. So they talk about these as desirable difficulties. Imposing difficulties on your learning can actually help you in the long run retain that information. Whereas if you study in a way that feels right and feels easy, it's not going to be as effective for your learning. And these are not intuitive. So we can't ignore the research in cognitive psychology when we're trying to figure out what would make a quality learning environment. It hurts if you're doing learning right. Yes, just like at the gym. Okay, so what I did, I was so bold as to try to propose a definition of how we can objectively see what rigor looks like in the classroom. How can we look beyond our idiosyncratic interpretations and try to come up with a way to define and assess and make better a context for learning, and not just maybe what we think in our minds is what it is. So I pulled these together, and I saw a need for teachers and students to play a very active role. And this could be, I'm using teachers and students, it could be learners, it could be trainers, any kind of work context that these would be helpful for. What this implies is that you need that dynamic ongoing interaction. You cannot determine rigor just from looking at a set of learning outcomes or a curriculum. You have to look and see how it's being implemented, how it's being delivered, how teachers and students are working together, what's being credited. This idea requires that teachers locate research evidence to guide their instruction, like I've summarized today, and generate new research when it's lacking. This pushes us beyond just assessing student learning into talking about the methods we're using and assessing what we're doing, and then making it available to other people so that we can all learn from it. And this idea is not new. This is the definition of scholarly teaching. But when I asked colleagues for what their definitions of academic rigor were, I didn't see that in those definitions. If we have a teacher who isn't effective in strategies to facilitate learning and improve memory, then how can it be a quality learning context? We've got to acknowledge the role of the teacher as well. What I did see a lot of is the role of the student and this in the student learning. So a lot of definitions will say students have to be actively engaged, and they have to get out of their comfort zone. They have to think deeply and critically about the content, and they have to apply what they're doing. And that's great, yes. But do students already know how to do this? And how are we going to help them be able to do that? That's the piece that we need to include in there as well. So we need to specify the teacher's role and the action teachers will take in this dynamic process, instead of putting the burden on the student or assuming the curriculum is going to take care of it. In this quality learning context, teachers need to provide opportunities for students to engage in content in an active and meaningful way. So they have to set up the environment so that students create their own interpretation, and they demonstrate what that interpretation is, and they can justify it with evidence. So the responsibility belongs to the teacher in creating a quality learning context, but students are the only one who can choose to learn. A teacher cannot force learning, and a teacher cannot do it without student participation. So the demands on the students, they need to be creating their own interpretation of the information, not passively accepting and regurgitating what the teacher tells them. So instead of being told what to do or believe or write, they need to assemble and make visible interpretations using these curated materials that the teacher has provided. And they need to learn search strategies to follow up on their information and support their interpretations with evidence. So going beyond just what the teacher provides, because at the end of the semester, they're not going to have that teacher anymore. So they need those skills to take with them to be able to learn and do it without having those curated resources. By searching for their own interpretation and by looking for their own resources, this gives students the opportunity to grapple with their own real life experiences and the new information they're getting, and synthesize and integrate that, just like Sheeny points out. Traditional tasks such as selecting multiple choice or fill in the blanks, that doesn't really provide an opportunity for students to go get that additional information. They're just regurgitating it back. And that is commonly missing in some of our assessment measures. Whenever we look at this dynamic interplay, the teacher has an additional role of making sure that these activities of the students cannot be circumvented through things like cheating or careless submissions and still receiving credit, or other threats that may harm or put their learning at risk. When we take a higher level, not a list of to-do things or required content, but we take a higher level definition, we're able to create a more fine-grained operational definition in specific disciplines, because some research is applicable and other research is applicable to other disciplines, and we can adapt it to the new research that's coming. Every meta-analysis turns up new moderator variables that can clarify when some things are more effective than others. And we need to be able to accommodate that. And we need to be able to have a definition of quality that doesn't reside in the student's mental space or in our own idiosyncratic definitions that we can lay on the table and say, here, this is what I'm doing. How can I make it better? Because then we can measure it, we can examine it, and we can improve on it. Okay, locating this in the context, I've seen curriculum confused with quality learning experiences and academic rigor. And so when I was trying to fit this in a space, I saw that the learning context is different than the program context that houses the curriculum. The learning context is that space that the students and the teachers occupy. It involves the course design and the course delivery and all of those interactions in that learning space, which are hopefully supported in the broader learning context. For things like HR departments have additional training, or our universities have tutoring centers and writing centers to support student learning. And these pieces can work together to shape that student learning. The student learning, we hope, is connected to the real world, so we can ease that transfer that we've talked about. We're preparing students for some career out there, not just to be a student forever. So we have this real world informing that curriculum that we're teaching students. And the curriculum is separate from the academic rigor, because I've heard some assumptions that we can make our program more rigorous by taking higher level curriculum and pushing it down into lower level courses. That misses the idea that any subject can be taught in a more or less rigorous way. So instead of thinking that curriculum will solve it, we need to make that distinction that it's actually what students are doing with it and the evidence that they're providing. That's what's making it more rigorous, and being a lifetime student is fine. The arrows on the inside of the circle here, that refers to what we can do with those student learning artifacts. If students are demonstrating their learning, we can use that for continuous improvement. We can inform the curriculum. We are making curriculum changes right now in the program that I'm in based on some student learning artifacts. We can go back and inform our own classes and the instruction we provide there. And we can inform those support services to make those better and more aligned with our curriculum. So the takeaway is, how might this stimulate conversations in your institution? I've used what I've learned and the research that I've found, putting to bed some of these assumptions to start conversations and to really push and challenge the ways that things have always been done in an attempt to make it better. So one of the things that I have been on, and when you do this, you get stuck on task force and committees, so be ready for that. But I've been on a task force to work on our teaching evaluations. And we really started questioning what it is are we measuring and what is the purpose of this? We had items, but what are we doing with it? What can we learn from it? One of the items on an old evaluation form was how many times the faculty member said or Well, that assumes a lecture. So why is lecture even assumed that that's what we have to do? And two, what's wrong with thinking on your feet? If you misspeak, or if you have to change information and say it in a different way, stumbling and bumbling, that's okay. Just keep going. I don't know that that really does anything to inform the quality of student learning. And looking at personality characteristics, is the faculty member caring and approachable? When you look at the research on these qualities are not necessarily associated with learning. And the goal of a quality learning environment, at least in my mind, has been to focus on learning. So maybe it's good to have faculty members who are nice, to have your trainers who are nice, but does that really have an impact on learning? There's some research that says maybe not. And whenever we're looking at these teaching evaluations, in addition to looking to what's on there, look to see what might be missing. On our teaching evaluations, there is no place for us to say, look at all the research I'm using to support my course design, and look at all I'm doing to support my course delivery. There's not a spot for that. Instead, I use my teaching philosophy for that, which my philosophy isn't a philosophy at all. It looks like a research article because I have a huge reference list with it, but there's no other place to put that. Do we need to have that? Do we need teaching evaluations that would better accommodate and account for the research that faculty are using to inform their instruction to improve student learning? For student ratings of instructions, similar ideas. And if we're not after student learning, then okay, we can measure other variables, that's fine. But if we're trying to measure student learning, how are we doing it? And how can we do it better? If we look at idiosyncratic experiences, ours currently ask, is the course rigorous? I have no idea what to do with that data. There's no definition of rigor provided. And I assume that students are comparing it to their other courses. So if my course is rigorous, that means it's more rigorous according to them than their other courses. But here we are with that idiosyncratic definition. I don't know what other faculty are doing. So do I need to tone mine down or scale mine up? I have no idea. So if we're looking at assessing rigor, how are we doing it? And is the data that's coming from it helpful? And then looking at popularity or positive relations with students, maybe we want faculty to be nice, and that's great. But if we're looking at student learning, there's not a relationship there with higher order thinking and relationship quality. The research I found was actually that it was a negative relationship. So it depends on what we want to do with the data, what we're trying to measure. But we need to be very intentional about that and state, this is the variable I'm trying to measure. This is how I want to use the data. What can we do to actually get that and get better? Some things that students might be able to evaluate instead of a personality contest for the teacher are characteristics of the learning environment. Maybe we can add things that would assess behaviors that students are engaging in that might support their learning. So how many times have you had to go find sources and support your own argument? Maybe that would be something that we could assess on these ratings of instruction that would better tap the opportunity they are given to learn. Assessment of student learning, just a question. What do you do with it? How is it measured? My assessment plan has to include perceptions of learning. That's fine. But perceptions of learning is not the same thing as actually demonstrating your learning by doing that particular behavior. So perceptions of learning are correlated with affect. And if we want to know how much people like their college experience, fine, we can measure that. But we can't assume that that perceived learning is a substitute for actual learning. And then when we look at the tasks that we're having students do, are they contrived and they don't match the real world environment? So there might be that problem with transfer, or are they more genuine and more realistic that they'll see again in the future? We know again about the context effects on learning, so it might be something that we can more closely replicate in our classroom. And then I'll stop here with the last one, but I'm sure there's other applications that you can take back to your institution, and I'll have you share those. But professional development, what are we doing to help faculty and teachers, trainers know this information? Are we providing research-based teaching tips or just things that have worked in the past? If they've worked in the past, let's do some research together on them to see how generalizable are they. Do we have folks coming in who do research in learning, maybe a cognitive psychologist or people working in the learning sciences? Do we have instruction on implementing high impact practices? We know though from research that faculty support for these things make them more likely for students to participate. So are there things we can add to our professional development that would be more helpful for faculty to actually make their teaching visible and accessible so that we could continuously improve it? Okay, so those were my ideas about things that I've done and some things that you might want to take back with you. What do you have? What might you be able to bring out of this presentation to take back with you? What conversations might you be able to bring on board at your institution? I'll take a moment to try to catch up in some of the chat. It looks like we've had some really good conversation. All right, I will entertain questions at the end. Let me go ahead and show you the resources that I've curated for you here. The reference list, I've included all the links to things that I've included in the presentation. And there's my email address. I find, like I said, I do this in my free time. I find it fascinating. So if you have anything where you have assumptions that need to be tested, maybe whenever you put this idea to use in your institution, email me and say, hey, this really worked and this really didn't, because I would be interested to know how we can tweak it, how we can make it better. This push for continuous improvement is not just something I do in my classroom. It's something I do in my research and in my thinking and in my interactions with faculty at my institution. So I would love to hear from you, and you can reach me at that email address. Oh, and having the conversation. I think that's it. I think that's really what we need to do, is instead of making the assumption and everybody just passively think, oh yeah, sure, that's how it works. Is it really? Let's ask the question, is it really? Online spatial environments. Oh, that looks interesting. Yes, and I've linked you to the Academic Rigor White Paper Series. If you're interested in that, you can take a look. This is a repackage of some of that information, but I'm obviously I'm more thorough in the papers than I can be in a short session like this.
Andrea, one person says they'd like an example of the student ratings of instruction.
Okay, so something that would be, let me back up in my slides. Student ratings of instruction, something that might be helpful is having students rate those qualities that they are expected to demonstrate rigor. So creating your own interpretation. Did you do that? Did you fill out multiple choice tests? Did you have an opportunity to create an argument and create a counter argument? What did you do to demonstrate your interpretation? Sure, we can measure that on a multiple choice test, but there are other ways that we can measure that would require the student to go get research support for what they're doing and then integrate it into their life experiences. And we may even want to ask them that directly. Did you struggle with things that did not match your prior experience? So that is not what you think of as, you know, how many pages did you read a week in a class, which is fine, but it could maybe tap into some of those behaviors students engaged in that would help promote their learning. Asking them how much they've learned. Well, I've already said we're terrible at that from cognitive psychology. We're not good at knowing that, but a student can self-report on the behaviors in which they engaged. And since we're trying to make learning measurable and make it where we can assess it, then having students report out on some of the things they did, that might be a better way. Granted, it's an indirect way, but any self-report of learning is going to be indirect unless we actually use a student artifact on what they've actually learned. But I would make a recommendation to go at some of these things that would encourage learning and not some things that don't. We have a very active chat. I can't keep up with it. Did I miss anything else? Yes, sacrificing rigor for popularity on evaluations. I am so fortunate. I have very supportive administrators who know that my ratings are going to be lower because I do require a little bit more work. So it's not a popularity contest, and that's okay. Oh yeah. Oh, and people who use the Quality Matters rubric just for course design, that alignment piece is so critical. It's like, let's pay attention to that alignment piece a little bit, because that's not just design. That goes into how can you build out intentional learning experiences? How can you deliver those learning experiences? So yes, not using it just as a check the block, but using it to have conversations and generate new ways of doing things.
Andrea, there's something posted a while back that
Okay.
caught my eye.
Okay, good. Thank you.
This person says, I'm unclear about the interchangeability of rigor with effectiveness or quality. Rigor is usually defined as inflexibility, severity, or difficulty. The faculty members I've known who focus on the term rigor tend to be the most resistant to the idea of providing structured learning activities to help their students learn. They have a sink or swim approach. Difficulty must match student level if students are to learn effectively, not too easy, not too hard.
Okay, yes. And that's addressed more fully in the white paper. Raga talks about rigor mortis. Rigor is rigor mortis. It's rigid, it's stiff, it's inflexible, my way or the highway. And there's a lot of literature that I did not cover today that talks about the ambiguity associated with academic rigor. So I went in and tackled the words academic rigor. Let's talk about this and let's unpack it. Let's link it to something that we can make better, we can make measurable, instead of something that exists differently in everyone's head. Whenever I first started this, I asked my colleagues, what do you think rigor is and rigor is not? One of my colleagues said, scaffolding is fine. Being able to provide supports for students to get them to learn the content is not a reduction in rigor. It is a way that you ensure rigor by helping students get to the standard. So I think people who are looking at rigor as a very limited, hard, make a test hard for the sake of it being hard, they're missing the point of their responsibility to set a context that the student has a chance of succeeding in, of being able to learn the content and demonstrate it on an assessment. So maybe instead of using rigor, we talk about quality learning environments instead.
Somebody asked for the white paper, and I am going to put those in the chat here. There's 2 links.
Thank you. And in the presentation on the screen, the hyperlink will take you to it. The one that I'm talking about, there's a couple that I cite in here, and it'll take you to both of them. But thank you for that.
Yeah, these are the ones that are on the QM website.
Yes, yes. And the citation is here at the end as well. Lose rigor, focus on quality learning. Yeah, that's kind of how I did the presentation. I did a paper on academic rigor. What I was really talking about was quality and how we can look at quality, but we need to at least have conversations about rigor to either give it a better definition or just set it aside and move on with what we are really after. Yes, and when you look at quality learning in the context, we have to provide those supports for learning in the classroom and beyond the classroom. So I don't think that is a problem for rigor at all, or quality learning, to actually teach students. I think that's part of the definition. I know I will not be able to get to everyone's comments, but I will take a look at the chat after this session. And I appreciate the huge amount of conversation there. I look forward to seeing what I can learn from you and seeing how we can push this even farther and make it better.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrea. It was a wonderful session.
Awesome, I enjoyed it. Thank you for helping us out, and thank you for hosting this for us. Quality Matters.
Super. I'm going to end the recording now.
Thank you.